For this project I used a 3/4 inch sheet of plywood that I had ripped down to about 30 inches over at a Home Depot. Now this was the width I was planning on making the box, so it was just easier to have the store rip it down for me. I started off by using just a standard Kreg jig to rip down two pieces of 16 by 30. Now these two pieces would end up being the bottom and the sides of the box once one of these pieces was cut in half. Now I know the Kreg jig isn't the best thing in the world to get perfectly square cuts, but there's an easy way to mitigate this, as we'll see later on in the video. With both of my pieces now cut out, I'm just going to go ahead and line them up and make sure that they're both roughly around the same size, which in this case they were, thankfully. Taking one of these pieces over to my miter saw, I'll go ahead and mark the center point. Now once this is cut in half, it'll be used for both of the side pieces, so it's very important that I try to get this as close as possible to center. I'll go ahead and flip over the piece because my miter saw is not long enough, and try our best to line it up with the original cut. Now I'll just go ahead and use some pocket holes to secure the sides to the bottom piece. I know pocket holes aren't the strongest joint in the world, but for a box of this size and the material I'm using, it'll be plenty strong. In order to really secure your pocket holes, make sure you lay down a bead of wood glue on your joints and spread out the glue to make sure you have even spread, and use the best tool available, which in this case is my finger. You'll know you're doing this right when you have about 80% of the glue on your finger instead of the joint, and now you're ready to put the two pieces together. Now for the other side of the box, I did cut off about 5 inches of this wall. This is for the folding tabletop cabinet mechanism. I did, however, cut off the wrong side of this wall by accident, so I didn't realize that until right now. But it's a pretty easy fix. All I had to do was pretty much build this whole thing 180 degrees, so the right became the left and the left became the right of the box. Now with the solution to my problem in hand, I went ahead and added more wood glue and attached the wall with a few more pocket screws. Flipping the box on its side, I went ahead and used a couple scrap pieces of wood as spacers to find the perfect alignment for the stove platform. After I found that, I just marked it with a pen and then used a carpenter square to complete that line all the way across. In a poor attempt at cutting down some weight for the box, I went ahead and cut down some strips of plywood. Now these strips are used for the stove to actually sit on and support. You could very well just use a shelf, but again, I was trying to save weight here, and realistically I probably saved a few grams. Now, assembling the stove platform is pretty straightforward. Using these strips of plywood, I went ahead and used some pocket screws and some wood glue to assemble them into an L shape. So one side would connect to the wall where I drew the line, and the other side would connect down to the bottom platform. Now here, I'm just cutting down another panel to use as the back of the box. Now, if you guys want to guess down in the comments what kind of super complex joinery I use to attach the back of the box to the back, I'm just kidding. It's more pocket screws. Come on, guys. I'm not that good at woodworking yet. But hey, they work. Now for this shot, I was super careful to orient the camera in such a way where it was really the only angle where you couldn't see anything that I was doing. I don't know how I managed to do that, guys. I'm just setting the camera down and working, but you can imagine what I'm doing. I'm using pocket screws to attach the back to the rest of the box. With the back of the box now installed, it was time to try to figure out the hinge tabletop mechanism. So I pretty much just set the hinge down and started to play around with how the hinge worked, different orientations, whether it would be better to mount it from the top or the side. And I think here I decided to mount it to the side, but once it folds down, you guys see there's going to be a little bit of a gap. In order to fix that, I went ahead and just traced out the thickest part of the hinge onto the sidewall, and my plan was to come back with a router and try to route out the channel, just so the hinge would sit a little more flush once it was folded out. Now this is where things start to get a little bit sketchy, just because there's no real good way to balance a router on such a thin edge. You can see I was kind of dancing around with it, trying to find the best orientation to put the router. Ultimately, this is kind of a dangerous thing to do, so I would not recommend doing it this way. Definitely build a jig or find some other way of routing out this corner. But I'm pretty lazy, and if I lose a couple fingers, it'd probably make good YouTube content. Now for the front two doors of the cabinet, I wanted the grain to match, so I cut it out of one piece of wood, and then went ahead and took that piece of wood and cut it in half on my miter saw. Now if you remember from earlier, I had cut off about 5 inches off of a wall. This was to connect to one of the doors of the cabinet. The main reason I'm doing this is so that when the door is swung out, it can support more of the middle of the folding tabletop. Another reason is that this just allows for the cabinet door to be a little more deep, which could allow me to put more shelving or mount things to. I just haven't decided what I want to do with this area yet. Now I like to use a little bit of blue masking tape just to hold the hinge in place. This just ensures that the hinge doesn't move while I'm securing it into place. It would be helpful to have a second pair of hands here, but unfortunately technology is not that great yet to allow me to have Dr. Octopus arms, so until then, blue masking tape works just fine. Once I've secured majority of the hinge with wood screws, I can take off the blue tape, which gives me access to the holes that were covered up before. With the tabletop door now in place, it's time to secure the folding tabletop. I put the stove back in its place just to have some sort of a support to hold the tabletop while I secure the hinge to it. Testing out the tabletop now, I hope it's a little more clear as to why I decided to recede the hinge further into the wall. This allows the door to catch more of the middle of the tabletop as opposed to the side. I just thought this would be a safer option because it'd be less likely to collapse if someone were to, say, bump into it, or if there was maybe some wind. Because the right side of the countertop is static as in not moving, I could just go ahead and secure it straight to the cabinet. Now the technique I'm using for this is something a little different than what I'm using before. These are called upside down pocket holes instead of regular pocket holes. The only difference being the jig's upside down. It's the same thing. It's just a bunch of pocket holes. Again, I told you guys from before. It's all pocket holes. Unfortunately, with the jig clamped in place, I couldn't fit my drill under and get it into the little channel that I need to go in. So what I had to do was unclamp the jig, put the drill bit inside of it, and then clamp it all together as one piece. I had to do this for every hole, but I only did a few here, so it really didn't take that long. Because I'm mounting the door hinge on the inside of the cabinet door, I have to recess a channel in order for the door hinge to sit in. This just allows the door to sit nice and flush up against the cabinet. Using a piece of scrap wood as a fence, I'll go ahead and run my router back and forth across the piece of wood to just make a nice channel, being careful as to where my fingers are. After inhaling about half a pound of sawdust into my lungs, I decided to go ahead and grab my respirator. Should have done this to begin with, but, you know, better late than never. And once again, I'll use a piece of blue masking tape just to hold the hinge in place while I secure it in with wood screws. I added a middle divider into the cabinet in order to separate it into two large compartments. Now you may notice that this dividing wall isn't exactly center in the cabinet. This is just to allow for enough clearance for the camp stove to open up in order to change out the butane canisters. Using a carpenter square and some clamps, I could ensure that this wall would go in at as close to a perfect 90 as I could get it. I added a base to the right side of this cabinet. This would allow me to tuck a collapsible camp sink underneath. Because the whole goal of this project was organization, I wanted everything to just have its dedicated spot that it went in, and I used this wooden sled that I made in order to make sure that this base went in as level as possible. I didn't want to have to go buy more hardware to mount a paper towel roll inside of the cabinet, so I just decided to try to make one out of scrap pieces of plywood. With my paper towel holder mounted, I could go ahead and throw a roll of paper towel on there just to test fit it and make sure I have enough clearance to close the door. I followed up all the edges with a flush cut router bit. This was just to hide all the uneven edges and just give the box a cleaner look. I followed up all the edges with some 80 grit sandpaper just to smooth them out. This was also where I realized where my missing roll of blue tape went. I guess it finally had enough of holding my whole project together and decided to just make a run for it. I finished off the box by just using a 1/4 inch roundover bit on all the harsh edges. This would allow it to be a little more comfortable to use as well as transporting. I didn't want the sharp edges to rub on my forearms or get snagged onto anything. Now with the sanding done and a few coats of polyurethane that I did off camera, it's time to see the completed build. I may eventually build a stand for this box, but for now I'll just use this folding table. Starting off on the outside of the box, I added these two handles to make it easier to carry when it was fully loaded. I added a chest latch to keep the door closed while transporting. On the right hand side of the box, I put in a shelf to add pots and pans. In the middle we have utensils, and at the very bottom we have our collapsible sink, which fits perfectly on our countertop. On the left, we of course have our stove, some cleaning supplies, and spare butane canisters on this 3D printed rack. At the very top, I also designed and printed this spice rack, as well as these mug holders. Now there's still plenty of space left on this left side door. I'm just not too sure what I want to add to it just yet. And that's it, guys. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed this build. Let me know down in the comments if you have any questions that I can answer. And please stay tuned for any future projects. Thanks.